Security walked me out of the building I'd worked at for 6 years, past coworkers who wouldn't meet my eyes, because my boss told Hare I'd stolen $40,000 from the company. What he didn't know was that I'd already found the real theft, his, 3 weeks earlier, and I'd been quietly documenting it ever since. Before I tell you how I ended up in that HR office being accused of something I never did, and what happened once the truth came out, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome to Kaynaat Revenge. Every week I share real, raw stories about the people who betray us, and the moment they finally get caught. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had someone try to take credit for your work, or worse, try to make you the villain to cover their own tracks. Hit subscribe, because this story is going to make you want to stand up and cheer by the end. Alright, let's go back to where this started, almost a year before that walk out of the building. My name is Danielle Reyes. I was 32 years old, working as a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized logistics company called Meridian Freight Solutions, headquartered just outside Atlanta, Georgia. I'd been there 6 years, starting as a junior analyst straight out of my MBA program and working my way up through steady, careful, unglamorous competence, the kind of employee who shows up early, double-checks every report, and rarely makes noise. My direct supervisor for the last 2 of those years was a man named Gregory Halston, our VP of Finance, who'd been brought in from outside the company specifically to modernize our financial reporting and cost control systems. Gregory was, in the way of a lot of executives I'd worked under, charismatic in meetings and vague about details in private, the kind of manager who was excellent at presenting other people's work as his own vision, dressed up with just enough of his own language to make it feel seamless. I want to be honest that I noticed this pattern with Gregory long before anything serious happened. Over those 2 years, I'd built and led the development of a new vendor cost optimization system, a genuinely complex piece of financial modeling that, once implemented, saved the company close to $2 million annually by renegotiating shipping contracts based on data patterns I'd personally identified after months of careful analysis. When it was presented to the executive board, Gregory presented it as his team's initiative, which technically wasn't false. I was on his team, but in the room, describing the models, the methodology, the specific insight that made the whole system work, he used the word I so consistently that afterward, 3 separate people from other departments congratulated him directly, by name, for what I had built almost entirely on my own. I brought this up once, carefully, in a one-on-one meeting, framing it as gently as I could, something like, I'd love to be more visible when we present the cost optimization results, since I built the core models. Gregory's response was smooth and dismissive in a way that, looking back, I recognize now as a kind of test. Danielle, that's how leadership works. I present the team's work, and I make sure the right people know who's actually doing it behind the scenes. I let it go, because I told myself that was, to some extent, how corporate hierarchies functioned, and because I still believed, at that point, that Gregory was fundamentally someone operating in good faith, even if he was a little too comfortable taking public credit. I had no idea, at that point, that the gap between what Gregory presented publicly and what was actually happening internally went far beyond taking undue credit for my work. I was about to find out it went much, much further. It started with something small and strange, the kind of detail that's easy to dismiss until it isn't. While reconciling quarterly vendor payment records for an unrelated audit prep project, I noticed a vendor name I didn't recognize, Halcyon Logistics Consulting, appearing on 3 separate invoices over the past year, totaling just under $60,000, categorized under a consulting budget line that Gregory directly controlled and approved without requiring secondary sign-off, a level of discretionary authority he'd specifically negotiated when he was hired. Curious, mostly out of the same careful, detail-oriented habit that had made me good at my job for 6 years, I looked up Halcyon Logistics Consulting through our vendor database, and later, through a basic business registry search. What I found made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't fully want to acknowledge yet. Halcyon Logistics Consulting was registered to an LLC whose listed agent was Gregory's brother-in-law, at a residential address in a suburb about 20 minutes from our headquarters. There was no consulting website, no other visible clients, no evidence of any actual business operations beyond receiving payments from Meridian Freight Solutions. I sat with that discovery for almost a week before doing anything further, partly out of disbelief and partly out of genuine fear about what it would mean to be right. I quietly pulled additional records over the following days, working carefully during normal work hours so nothing about my activity would look unusual, and found that the pattern went back nearly 2 years, not just the $60,000 I'd initially found, but closer to $210,000 in payments to Halcyon Logistics Consulting for strategic advisory services that, as far as I could determine through any legitimate channel, had never actually been performed. 3 weeks after I found that first invoice, before I'd decided what, if anything, to do with what I'd found, I was called into an unscheduled meeting with Gregory and our HR director, a woman named Patricia Sung. Gregory's expression, I remember, was carefully composed in a way that, looking back, I now understand was rehearsed. Patricia informed me that an internal review had flagged irregularities in expense reports I'd submitted over the past year, specifically pointing to a pattern of reimbursement requests for client travel and vendor meetings that, according to the documentation Gregory presented, didn't match actual travel records, totaling approximately $40,000 in what they characterized as fraudulent reimbursement claims. I remember the specific, disorienting vertigo of being accused of something I knew with complete certainty I hadn't done, while the person making the accusation sat across from me with a folder of documents that looked, at a glance, disturbingly official. I asked to see the specific expense reports in question. Patricia, following what I later understood was Gregory's carefully constructed narrative, explained that, given the seriousness of the allegations, I would be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation, and that, per company policy, I would need to be escorted from the building that day. I want you to understand exactly what it felt like to walk through that office, past co-workers I'd known for years, with a security guard beside me, carrying a small box of desk items, while Gregory stood in his office doorway, watching with an expression I can only describe, in hindsight, as barely concealed relief. It took me 2 days, sitting at home in a kind of stunned, furious disbelief, to fully understand what had actually happened. Gregory hadn't stumbled onto some genuine irregularity in my expense reports. He had, I would later prove conclusively, altered specific reimbursement records to fabricate a pattern of fraud that matched, almost dollar for dollar, a portion of the actual money he himself had been funneling to his brother-in-law's shell company, money that, if anyone ever properly audited it, needed a scapegoat already established and discredited before that audit could ever seriously begin. I was that scapegoat, 6 years of careful, reliable work, and Gregory had decided, the moment he sensed any risk that I might have noticed his actual theft, that framing me was more efficient than simply hoping I hadn't. The breaking point, for me, wasn't actually the walk out of the building, devastating as that was. It came 2 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, going back through every email, every meeting note, every piece of internal documentation I'd saved over 6 years, out of nothing more than professional habit, trying to understand exactly how thoroughly Gregory had constructed this. What I found, buried in my own saved files, was worse than I'd expected. 6 weeks earlier, a full week before I'd even discovered the Halcyon Logistics Consulting payments, Gregory had sent Patricia in HR a preliminary email, one I'd been copied on almost incidentally as part of a larger distribution list, mentioning some concerning patterns in departmental expense reports that he wanted to keep an eye on. At the time, buried in a routine email chain, I hadn't thought anything of it. Reading it again with new eyes, the timeline became sickening and clear. Gregory had begun building a paper trail to discredit me, weeks before I ever found evidence of his own fraud, which meant either he'd anticipated I might eventually notice something, given how closely I worked with the vendor payment systems, or, more disturbingly, he'd simply decided I was a convenient, credible target regardless of what I did or didn't find. Someone whose reputation he could preemptively damage to protect himself if anyone ever came looking. I sat at that kitchen table and felt something shift completely inside me. The fear and disorientation of the previous 2 days, hardening into something much colder and more useful. I wasn't going to let 6 years of my professional reputation get erased by a man who had spent those same years quietly stealing from the company while taking credit for the work that actually mattered. I was going to prove, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what had really happened, not just to clear my own name, but to make sure Gregory faced the consequences of what he'd actually done, instead of successfully offloading them onto me. I hired an employment attorney immediately, a sharp, methodical woman named Renata Vasquez, who specialized in wrongful termination and corporate whistleblower cases. She was direct with me from our first call, given that I had documentation showing Gregory had begun building a case against me before I'd found any evidence of his fraud. Combined with what I already knew about Halcyon Logistics Consulting, this wasn't simply a wrongful termination case. This was a genuine opportunity, if handled correctly and carefully, to expose real corporate fraud while simultaneously clearing my name. Renata's first critical piece of advice was that I needed to be extremely careful about how I gathered further evidence, since anything obtained improperly, accessing systems I no longer had legitimate access to, for instance, could compromise both my own legal standing and any eventual case against Gregory. Fortunately, before my administrative leave began, I had already, through entirely legitimate, routine work activity, saved copies of the vendor payment records and the Halcyon Logistics Consulting business registry information to my personal email, the same routine documentation habit that had let me piece together Gregory's email timeline. That evidence, gathered before my access was revoked and through channels I'd used regularly and legitimately throughout my normal job duties, became the foundation of everything that followed. Renata helped me formally engage an independent forensic accountant, a meticulous man named David Okafor, who conducted a full analysis of the Halcyon Logistics Consulting payments against Meridian's actual financial records and industry-standard consulting rates for the supposed services. His findings were stark. Not only was there no evidence any legitimate consulting work had ever been performed, but the payment pattern showed clear structuring. Amounts kept consistently just below thresholds that would have triggered additional internal review, a detail that strongly suggested deliberate, sophisticated concealment rather than a simple accounting error. At the same time, Renata filed a formal response to my administrative leave and termination, including a detailed rebuttal of the fabricated expense report allegations, supported by my actual travel and calendar records, which directly contradicted the specific claims in Gregory's documentation. This filing was carefully worded to preserve my legal position while not yet revealing everything I knew about Halcyon Logistics Consulting. Renata's strategy was to first force the company to formally engage with and investigate the fabricated allegations against me, establishing on record that they were false, before introducing the far more serious evidence of Gregory's actual fraud, which she believed would carry more weight and be harder to bury or minimize once my own credibility had already been formally restored. I also, at Renata's suggestion, filed a confidential report with Meridian's board-level audit committee, a channel that existed specifically to bypass compromised management, which Gregory, despite his seniority, didn't have direct control over. This report included David's forensic analysis alongside my documentation of the suspicious email timeline, providing the audit committee with a complete, carefully organized picture of what had actually happened, submitted through a channel Gregory had no visibility into until the investigation was already formally underway. The company's internal investigation into my supposedly fraudulent expense reports collapsed within 2 weeks once Renata's rebuttal, supported by concrete travel and calendar records, was formally reviewed. The discrepancies Gregory had presented simply didn't hold up against verifiable, independently confirmable documentation. HR formally reversed my termination, reinstating me with back pay, though I want to be honest that by this point, the idea of simply returning to my old role, working under Gregory again as though nothing had happened, felt genuinely impossible. That reinstatement, however, was really only the first part of what followed. Once my name was formally cleared, Renata and I moved forward with the audit committee report, which had already, in the background, triggered its own independent investigation into the Halcyon Logistics Consulting payments. David's forensic report, combined with the business registry evidence connecting the shell company to Gregory's brother-in-law, gave the audit committee more than enough grounds to bring in outside forensic auditors for a full review of Gregory's discretionary spending authority over the previous 2 years. I remember the specific, quiet satisfaction of the day Patricia from HR called to inform me, in a notably different tone than our previous conversation, that Gregory had been placed on administrative leave himself, pending the outcome of a formal fraud investigation. The same words, almost verbatim, that had been used to walk me out of the building weeks earlier, now applied to the person who had engineered that exact outcome for me. The full investigation ultimately confirmed what David's initial analysis had suggested. Over roughly 22 months, Gregory had funneled approximately $230,000 through Halcyon Logistics Consulting for services that were never performed, using his discretionary approval authority specifically to avoid the secondary review that would have caught it earlier. Meridian's board terminated Gregory for cause, and given the scale and clear intentionality of the fraud, the company's legal team referred the case to federal prosecutors, since Meridian was a company that did business across state lines, bringing wire fraud statutes into play. Gregory was indicted roughly 5 months later on federal wire fraud charges. I testified before a grand jury, providing the original documentation and timeline I'd carefully preserved, and later, once the case moved toward trial, provided a formal deposition laying out exactly how he had attempted to use fabricated allegations against me to preemptively discredit anyone who might discover his actual fraud. He ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial, pleading guilty to wire fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence that still included significant prison time, full restitution to Meridian, and a permanent bar from serving in any corporate financial oversight role in the future. Meridian offered me Gregory's former position, VP of Finance, about 4 months after his termination, once the company's leadership had fully absorbed exactly how thoroughly I'd been the one to actually protect them from what turned out to be a serious, ongoing fraud. I took the role, along with a compensation package that Renata negotiated to account for both the promotion itself and, separately, a settlement covering the reputational and emotional harm of my wrongful termination. A settlement Meridian agreed to readily, understanding clearly how much legal exposure they'd faced by initially trusting Gregory's fabricated documentation over 6 years of my actual, verifiable work history. I think about that walk out of the building sometimes, past coworkers who wouldn't meet my eyes, carrying a small box of desk items while Gregory watched from his office doorway. I think about how certain he must have felt, in that moment, that he'd successfully protected himself by making me the story instead of him. What I feel now, honestly, when I think about that moment, isn't lingering anger. It's something closer to full, uncomplicated satisfaction, the specific, rare kind that comes from watching a carefully constructed lie collapse completely under the weight of patient, methodical truth. I run the finance department now with a level of transparency and secondary review that I insisted on implementing as one of my first changes in the role, not out of paranoia, but because I understand, in a way I didn't fully appreciate before all of this, exactly how much damage unchecked discretionary authority can do, both to a company's finances and to the people who might get blamed for someone else's theft. Every vendor relationship over a certain threshold now requires 2 independent sign-offs. I built that system myself, and this time, when it was presented to the board, I made absolutely sure everyone in the room understood exactly whose work it was. If someone has ever tried to make you the villain in a story you didn't write, to protect themselves from consequences that were always theirs to carry, I hope this reminds you that the truth, documented carefully and patiently, is more powerful than any lie, no matter how convincingly it's told. Thank you so much for listening tonight. If this story had you cheering by the end, the way it still does for me, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to Kaynaat Revenge, because next week I'll be back with another true-to-life story of betrayal and the moment justice finally caught up.